Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. Last night, Narendra Modi met Barack Obama. Was it a meeting of titans, but did it also have something of the clash of opposites? It happened after Mr. Modi's meeting with American CEOs and a thoughtful address to the Council for Foreign Relations. Tonight in Part 2, we look back on all three events and ask, how successful was the Indian Prime Minister? But first, there is no more thoughtful a thinker on Indo-US relations than the scholar Ashley Tellis. So far, he hasn't commented on the Modi visit, but he has, however, written a critical article for the Carnegie Endowment on the challenges Mr. Modi faces and the critical steps he must take. Does Ashley Tellis think Mr. Modi is succeeding, and are Indo-US relations on the path to recovery? And now joining me live from Washington the morning after the Modi-Obama dinner and just minutes before the two heads of government meet for their formal talks is the man I'm talking about, the well-known American scholar Ashley Tellis. Ashley Tellis, in a recent article you've written for the Carnegie Endowment called Kickstarting the US-Indian Strategic Partnership, you describe Indo-US relations as a faltering partnership. You say the strategic relationship is in a rut. Can you begin by explaining, in your eyes, how serious is the situation? How deep is the rut?
Well, I think it has been a tale of lost opportunities in the last few years. The relationship obviously began very, very strongly in the last years of the last century. It took off with great momentum under President Bush and Prime Minister Vajpayee. And it sustained itself actually quite dramatically in the first term of the Manmohan Singh government. From the second term of the UPA, however, things began to slow down, largely because the United States was consumed by other crises. And the loss of economic momentum in India only complemented that lack of attention. So as things stand today, I think both countries are really struggling to put the partnership back on that upward trajectory that they had taken for granted would be the normal in the years of the Vajpayee and the early Singh governments.
Now, last night, Prime Minister Modi started his two-day visit to America with a private dinner with President Obama. And there were only 5 senior persons from either side present at that dinner. It's now 10:30 in the morning in Washington, the day after that dinner. What have you heard about how that dinner went?
By all accounts, it was a quite remarkable event. The President and the Prime Minister had a lot of opportunities and a lot of time to really talk through about themselves, to talk through issues relating to themselves, their own histories, their experiences on coming into office, just the kind of things you would want to have if a personal relationship is to be built. The only curious thing I thought about the dinner was the focus on open governance, which was a somewhat strange subject for a first conversation. But leaving that aside, I think the context of the conversation, the way the event was structured, really created opportunities for both the president and the prime minister to get to know each other.
Now,
and with a little bit of luck, that process will continue into this morning. We'll have extended bilaterals. Okay. And I believe there will also be time for a private meeting, maybe with a small group of aides early this morning as well. So now, the short answer, Karan, is that the dinner last night, produced everything that could be expected. It was a wonderful opportunity for the two leaders to meet in an informal setting.
Now, in your article, you've identified 3 core tasks for Prime Minister Modi in repairing what you call the faltering partnership. And the first, you say, is to build a strong connection with Obama of the kind Prime Minister Modi has with his Japanese counterpart Shinzo Abe. Why is a personal relationship between Modi and Obama so important to repairing the faltering partnership?
Well, because I think on many issues that consume both countries, Personal decisions and personal attention will be required by the two heads of state. These are not issues that will be resolved simply by letting the bureaucracies in both countries, have their day. And I don't think you're going to get the kind of decisions that are productive unless the Prime Minister has a stake in the President's success and vice versa.
Okay.
And so I think it's really important that a personal chemistry begin to evolve so that the right decisions get made in ways that take the partnership forward.
Now, in fact, it's not just President Obama that you believe Prime Minister Modi needs to win over. You say in your article that he needs to, and I'm quoting you, charm the socks off congressmen and senators on Capitol Hill. But with the House not in session and with Mr. Modi only meeting Speaker Boehner, has he got enough opportunity on this visit to do that?
Well, probably won't have, the kind of opportunity that would be desirable. But he certainly has to make the best of the circumstances. Meeting, the Speaker of the House is extremely important because in all likelihood, come November, Mr. Boehner will still continue to be the Speaker of the House. And so building that partnership, I think, is extremely critical. Remember, the Congress has been one of India's strongest supporters now for close to a decade and a half. And it would have been nice if the calendar allowed the Prime Minister to address a joint session, but since that is not going to happen, the next best thing that we have available to us is this private conversation between the congressional leadership and the Prime Minister later today. Now, and he has to make the best of it.
Now, in fact, from what I can tell of the Prime Minister's schedule, the only senior Republicans he's meeting is Speaker Boehner and yesterday or day before Governor Nikki Haley. Are you concerned that the Prime Minister hasn't made more of an effort to get to know the top ranks of the Republican leadership?
I think, this is a difficult issue and a difficult time. Primarily because of the electoral considerations. I mean, Congress is, looking forward to the elections to come. People are out in their districts. The legislative branch is not in session. So there are real constraints that he has. I think of this as essentially the first step in what will be a long process. I hope if the meetings go well today, the Prime Minister will extend an invitation to Speaker Boehner and to others who may be present in the meeting to come and visit India. And that this will be the beginnings of a continuing partnership between the legislative branch and the government of India. Now,
the Prime Minister held quite a spectacular rally with nearly 20,000 people in attendance on Saturday evening at Madison Square Garden. There were some 50-odd senators and congressmen present witnessing, hearing and seeing him. What sort of message do you think they will convey back to their colleagues on Capitol Hill? And what sort of message do you think has gone to President Obama and the White House of that meeting and of Mr. Modi's popularity and his ability to appeal to Indo-Americans?
I think the single fact, that comes out of that terrific performance at Madison Square Garden and in Central Park is that the Prime Minister enjoys the respect, even the adulation of large segments of the Indian diaspora in the United States. And I think that is of some political value. You don't want to overstate that, though, because you must remember that Indian Americans, broadly speaking, are predominantly Democratic, but more importantly, they are not swing voters in any swing state.
Okay.
So I think it's important to recognize that having that tie has some political benefits for the Prime Minister, but it's not as if Indian Americans are critical actors in American domestic politics. I mean, the demography essentially determines that basic fact. So I think they will take back the message that, here is someone who can really shake it up with the best of them, who really enjoys the support of the community, in the United States. And that could, in some circumstances, provide a useful glue as both sides attempt to repair the relationship.
Coming back to that critical article you wrote recently for the Carnegie Endowment, it was called Kickstarting the US-Indian Strategic Partnership. You said the second critical task facing Prime Minister Modi is to rejuvenate the concept of strategic partnership. Now, no one would deny that clearly needs to be done. The question is, how should the Prime Minister go about doing it?
The most important thing that the Prime Minister has to do is have a conversation with leaders in the United States, and that's primarily the President today, about whether both countries are really united by a set of common strategic objectives. I know we, take great pride in the commonalities of our democracy and our shared values. But at the end of the day, what are we working towards? I mean, what are the common goals that both countries are focusing on? I think that is really the first issue that requires clarity. And I'm not sure there is strategic clarity on that question.
Okay.
The second, which follows from the first, is, having identified what those common goals are, assuming that both leaders do it successfully this morning, how do both sides cooperate to make that happen? Now, this really requires a conscious effort at walking the extra mile. And the example I often, give is the way the Vajpayee government and the Bush administration worked with respect to Iraq. Clearly, there were differences about the Iraq war. The Vajpayee government was not a great enthusiast about what the United States was doing at that time. But it was very careful in the way it managed Indian diplomacy, Indian criticism, India's public response to the Iraq war. And when the war was completed, it really looked very closely at finding ways at helping the United States, get out of the pickle that we had found ourselves in at that point. We need something analogous where you recognize that there are common goals, and then both sides really look for ways to walk the extra mile in order to make life easier for the other partner.
Now, in fact, in that article, you've identified what you call 3 critical rules on which a strategic partnership can be built. You say, first, there should be no surprises between each other. Secondly, you must discuss disagreements vigorously, but always keep them private and always ensure they remain contained. And third, and perhaps most importantly, look for ways to support the other side on issues that matter deeply to it. When you referred earlier to how the relationship had actually wound down during the last 5 years, what's called UPA2 in India, was that because these rules were either ignored or worse still, they were flouted?
I think that's unfortunately the truth, that for a long time now, these rules have essentially atrophied. Both sides have pursued policies without adequate, pre-briefing of the other. It's not a good thing when leaders discover that the government, which is supposedly their strategic partner, is about to do something, but they find that out only in the newspapers. That's not a smart thing, obviously, to keep a relationship in good repair.
Okay.
So surprises have been aplenty on both sides. The second question about, containing differences, attempting to mitigate them, again, has been something that I don't think either side has, successfully done.
Okay.
And then the last rule, which is walking the extra mile, I don't think we've seen that happen in recent times. I mean, that is truly, the last time I think we saw it was with the nuclear deal, but that was about it.
Mr. Tellis, I'm going to ask you to give me slightly shorter answers because I don't want to run out of time before I finished asking you all the things I want to ask you. But bearing in mind your third point, which is you must ensure that you can support the other side on issues that deeply matter to it. At this moment today, what are the issues that deeply matter to President Obama where he would want Indian support? Name, if you can, the top 3 quickly.
I think the most important would be working together to rebuild the global trading system, holding to the agenda in the WTO. That would be the first. The second would be a meeting of the minds on how we deal with the crises in the Middle East, particularly the challenges posed by ISIS. And the third would be looking at ways to expand the bilateral economic relationship.
Very quickly on that first one. which is the trade facilitation agreement under the auspices of the WTO. It's well known that, in fact, the Modi government reneged on the UPA's commitment to go ahead as recently as July this year. But yesterday at the Council for Foreign Relations, the Prime Minister made crystal clear that he was 101% in favour of trade facilitation. I'm using his exact words. But that at the same time, India's food security policies and laws could not be ignored. Is the American administration in a position to offer a permanent peace clause, as they call it, rather than just a 4-year one? Because that could bridge the difference between the two. Could that therefore be on the table when they meet this morning?
Sure, it will be discussed. But remember, this is not an issue that the United States can resolve unilaterally. This has to be part of a larger multilateral conversation, because to offer India a permanent peace clause is going to require the acquiescence of all the negotiating parties in the WTO. My own view is that this is rather improbable. The best that can be done is to look for ways to address the two concerns that India has, which is to maybe change the baselines that are used for calculating the years in which subsidies kick in, and maybe make some adjustments with respect to the timing of the implementation of the accord. But this will certainly require more than the United States.
Now, from the Indian point of view, perhaps the single biggest issue is the concerns that flow out of America's withdrawal from Afghanistan. I know there are also issues like visas and totalization, but I think the biggest of the lot are issues that flow out of America's withdrawal from Afghanistan. And India fears, first of all, the destabilization of that country, and secondly, it fears that in fact there could be a terror blowback to India, particularly Kashmir. What can President Obama say that could reassure Mr. Modi on that count, given that in fact Mr. Modi's concerns flow out of President Obama's policies?
Is obviously that puts the president in a somewhat awkward position, because I think you've described the predicament accurately. The best I think President Obama can do is to make 3 points. First, that the United States will continue to stay engaged in Afghanistan long after its troops come home. That's extremely important, because Afghanistan will not survive without international aid, particularly American aid. The second thing the president can do is to make certain that he will share continuing intelligence and continuing technical assistance for India to deal with the strategic challenges that arise out of the American withdrawal. And the third is that the president will support a very robust Indian presence and continued Indian engagement in Afghanistan, that the president will not be swayed by opposition that emanates particularly from Pakistan to a robust Indian presence in Afghanistan.
In fact, it's the Pakistan factor I want to take up, because America's withdrawal requires close cooperation from the Pakistan government and clearly from the Pakistan army in particular. And many in India believe, perhaps even fear, that that will have an impact on America's attitude to Pakistan's involvement in terror. On the other hand, India looks upon Pakistan as the epicenter of terror. Is there therefore a likelihood over the next 6 months or 1 year, or maybe 2 years as that withdrawal happens, that Pakistan could become an issue of concern between Washington and Delhi?
I think Pakistan already is an issue of concern between the two countries. But I think India's worst fears that somehow the United States will double down on appeasing Pakistan in order to have an organized and orderly withdrawal. I think those fears are highly exaggerated.
Okay.
Because the Pakistanis, do not have as many cards to play as Indian strategists sometimes fear. And the US-Pakistan relationship is at a point where I think, diminishing returns have set into all strategies of American appeasement. So both countries have to continue to discuss Pakistan. Both countries will continue to be at risk because of various things that Pakistan does. But I think the era when the United States will really work with Pakistan to the detriment of India, I think that era has long passed.
Coming back to your article, the third of the 3 tasks that you identified for Prime Minister Modi was to co-opt American civil society to support India's development. And clearly by that, what you meant was woo American companies to invest in India. Now, Mr. Modi yesterday had breakfast with 11 American CEOs. He met 6 others separately for one-to-one meetings. Do you have any feedback on how those meetings went? How impressive was the Prime Minister's attempt to convince them to come and invest in India, and what their response and reaction would have been?
Too early to get that. In fact, I have not met any of the CEOs who met the Prime Minister, though I had briefed a couple of them before their meetings. The point that they made, though, which I think is the one that we ought to pay attention to, is that they were expecting him to be extremely persuasive and extremely energetic in making the case for them to expand their investments in India. And I think they want to do that, not as a favor to India, but simply because it improves their own bottom line. But what they fear is that the exhortation which they expected in the meetings may not be reflected in the policy changes that they would like to see the Prime Minister implement at home. So even if the Prime Minister was extremely persuasive, I think it will take some time, because these American companies are going to be waiting and watching to see what happens in the, between now and say the next budget.
It's those policy changes that I want to pick you up upon, because in that article for the Carnegie Endowment, you said American companies will make a beeline for India only when the enabling environment is propitious. And you added that the July budget didn't convince American business that a pot of gold lies at the end of the Indian rainbow. Can you identify for me, really pretty quickly, because we're running short of time, what you believe are the 3 most important steps needed to create that enabling environment?
The first thing that American companies are looking for is a conclusive end to tax terrorism. That the regulatory and the enforcement regimes will not be used for purposes of coercion. The second thing that American companies are looking for is essentially for freedom to operate in the markets, increased FDI limits, greater opportunities to invest, and so on and so forth. And the third is with respect to eliminating unnecessary and cumbersome bureaucratic procedures. The Prime Minister has certainly, taken a stab at this last item, but we have yet to make sufficient progress, I think, on the first 2.
In fact, bearing the first 2 in mind, I want to put something to you. To what extent are American CEOs concerned, if not put off, by 4 things that have happened over the last 2 years? I'm talking about, to begin with, the Supreme Court's decision to scrap 122 2G licenses at one go, followed by something that happened just 2 weeks ago. The same Supreme Court scrapped 214 coal blocks at one go. Then 2 years previously, the UPA government retrospectively amended tax laws. Vodafone is the critical company that suffered, but there are several others. And the new government hasn't reversed that retrospectivity. All it's done is promise it won't be repeated. And finally, there's the new government's decision to renege on the old government's commitment to the WTO over the trade facilitation agreement. Has all of that taken together worried American CEOs that Indian commitments can't be relied upon? That if they were to bring their money in, they might find India unpredictable and unreliable. Is that a major concern that needs to be addressed?
That is the fundamental concern. If people do not have confidence that contracts have sanctity, that if there is a disagreement about contracts, that these disagreements will be adjudicated in impartial and fair ways, I don't think you are going to get the kind of investment that the Prime Minister wants. So there are real issues that have to be done with respect to creating an institutional regime in India that favors long-term investments, particularly with projects that have long gestation periods. I mean, when you make investments in infrastructure, when you make investments in power plants, these are not investments that bear returns within a matter of weeks or months. These are things that bear returns over years, if not decades. And so you really need to have a certain confidence that the institutional regime under which you are putting resources in India will be a stable regime and a regime that is fair.
Now, in fact, Mr. Tellis, as we've been talking, Prime Minister Modi has reached the White House. We just showed footage of the Prime Minister's cavalcade driving into the portico, the Prime Minister getting out and going in. So now, in fact, we can safely say that those summit-level talks at the delegation level between the two heads of government are underway. We're coming to the end of this interview, Mr. Tellis, but there is something else I want to pick you up on, and this is the point. You say in your article that American investors are willing to extend some latitude to India in the hope that either during the rest of this fiscal year or by the next budget, the critical policy announcements they want to see will happen, which clearly suggests to me that Mr. Modi has roughly 6 months to deliver the structural reforms, the commitments and reassurances that will entice American investment to India. What happens if domestic politics or other concerns stops Mr. Modi delivering within that time frame?
It would be really unfortunate, because as one American CEO put it, the political backing, the mandate of this kind that Mr. Modi received cannot deliver, then what hope is left? Because most people imagine that with his political power, particularly the kind of majority that he enjoys in the lower house, if that doesn't allow him to make these kinds of changes, then I think people will begin to look again at India, but unfortunately this time with jaundiced eyes.
In which case, am I right in saying that the obvious conclusion that emerges, not just from the interview you've given me just now, but from the article you wrote for the Carnegie Endowment, is that this is a truly critical moment in Indo-US relations? If the right steps are taken, that relationship could move speedily and perhaps decisively forward. But if those right steps aren't taken, and aren't taken within that critical 6-month horizon, then this relationship will stagnate. And worse still, a stagnating relationship begins to diminish itself as well. So are we then saying this is a critical moment?
That is exactly right. And I think the Prime Minister knows that. And I'm hoping that the conversations that take place this morning really make some headway in addressing exactly this issue.
All right, Mr. Tellis, thank you very much for joining us. I deeply appreciate the fact that you made time for us on a day when I know that you would rather have been keeping your ear to the ground and finding out exactly what the two heads of government are getting up to. That was Ashley Tellis, the well-known American scholar, talking to us about the critical challenges facing Prime Minister Modi as he walks into the White House and begins his delicate-level talks with the American president.